Welcome back, listeners, to another thrilling episode of Radio 13, the chilling detective horror series. Tonight, we dive deeper into the story with the 7 Curses, Episode 2. Sit back, relax, and enjoy a spine-tingling weekend evening with us. Chapter 1. The Manifestation. The early morning mist hung over Shadow Ridge Hospital like a veil of secrets, swirling through the skeletal trees that lined the cracked pavement. Jason, Emily, and Dr. Carter stood at the entrance, each lost in their own thoughts. The encounter with the Curse of Pride had left them physically exhausted and emotionally raw. But there was no turning back now. They had barely escaped the first curse, and already the next was calling to them. Greed, Jason muttered under his breath, staring up at the dilapidated building. The once grand hospital, with its towering brick walls and broken windows, felt more alive than ever. Shadows danced behind every corner, as if the building itself was waiting for their return. Emily shivered, though the morning wasn't cold. It feels different today, like something's watching us. Dr. Carter, normally the most rational of the group, looked unsettled as well. The next curse has already begun manifesting. We need to stay sharp. Greed is more subtle than pride. It sneaks up on you, slowly poisoning your mind until you're no longer thinking clearly. Jason, clutching his backpack tighter, gave a nod of agreement. Let's get inside. The sooner we start, the sooner we can figure out how to stop this one. As they entered the hospital, the familiar stench of decay and stale air hit them. It was as if the hospital had frozen in time. The same flickering lights, the same peeling paint. But today, the air felt heavier, laden with anticipation. The first sign that something was off came almost immediately. As they walked down the central corridor toward the records room, they passed a series of locked doors, each marked with a small plaque. One caught Emily's eye. Dr. Jonathan Latham, head of hospital finance, she read aloud. The plaque glinted in the dim light, but something was strange about it. It looked polished, almost new. Odd, considering everything else in the hospital was decayed beyond recognition. Jason stopped, noticing the same thing. That's strange. Why would this one plaque be so well kept? Dr. Carter frowned. Maybe there's something we're missing. Dr. Latham? Wasn't he involved in some sort of scandal? She pulled out a folder from her bag, thumbing through their collected notes. Here, he was accused of embezzling funds from the hospital. There was a whole investigation, but it was never concluded. He died under mysterious circumstances before it could go to trial. That would fit the curse of greed, Emily said softly, her fingers tracing the edge of the plaque. If this curse is tied to the hospital's finances, Latham would be at the center of it. Jason hesitated for a moment, then tried the door handle. Locked. He glanced at Emily. We'll come back to this later. Let's check the records room first. They continued down the hallway, their footsteps echoing in the eerie silence. As they approached the records room, the door creaked open on its own, revealing rows upon rows of filing cabinets. Jason felt a chill run down his spine. It was as if the hospital wanted them to find something. Inside, the air was thick with dust, and the dim light from their flashlights cast long shadows across the room. Emily went to work, rifling through the cabinets, while Dr. Carter took out a series of old financial ledgers that looked barely touched by time. Jason, meanwhile, scanned the shelves, looking for anything that might give them a lead on how greed had infected the hospital. His eyes landed on a stack of manila folders marked Special Accounts. He pulled one open and froze. Emily, Dr. Carter, look at this. They gathered around as Jason spread the documents across the table. Detailed financial records, many of them leading to private accounts under the names of prominent hospital figures. Doctors, board members, and even administrators. But what stood out most were the sudden surges in wealth during a period of the hospital's decline. Look at these amounts, Dr. Carter whispered. This is more than just embezzlement. This is greed, plain and simple. They were siphoning money meant for patient care, redirecting it to their own pockets while the hospital crumbled. Emily pointed to a familiar name, Dr. Latham. He was in charge of the hospital's finances, and look, these dates, this started long before the hospital shut down. They were stealing from the patients for years. Jason clenched his jaw. This is how the curse operates. It's not just one person's greed, it's systemic. Everyone who touched that money was part of the curse, and it spread through the hospital like a disease. Dr. Carter flipped through more documents, her brow furrowed. And the more they took, the worse the hospital became. The greed consumed them, and in the end, it destroyed the entire system. Just as Jason was about to speak, a cold draft swept through the room, and the door to the records room slammed shut. The lights flickered, and a soft whispering filled the air. Emily grabbed Jason's arm. "Did you hear that?" They stood still, the whispering growing louder, but none of them could make out the words. It was as though the hospital itself was trying to communicate with them, urging them deeper into its mysteries. "We need to leave," Dr. Carter said, her voice shaky. "This place, it's starting again. The curse is trying to influence us." Jason nodded, but his gaze lingered on the documents. They couldn't just walk away. Not yet. "We'll come back for these, but you're right, we can't stay here." As they gathered their things, Emily's hand brushed against an old, worn journal tucked away in one of the shelves. Curious, she slipped it into her bag without a word. Something about it felt important, though she couldn't explain why. They hurried out of the records room and back into the hallway, but the hospital had changed. What was once a relatively straightforward path now seemed darker, more oppressive. The walls appeared to shift slightly, warping under the dim, flickering lights. The oppressive atmosphere grew thicker, as if the very air around them was filled with a kind of unspoken hunger. "What the hell?" Jason muttered, stopping in his tracks. The hallway, which they had just come through, now stretched on endlessly in front of them, twisting unnaturally. Emily clutched the strap of her bag, her eyes wide as she stared down the corridor. "This isn't right. The hospital, it's changing." Dr. Carter's face was pale, her breath coming in shallow bursts. "It's the curse," she whispered. "It's already affecting us. Greed. It warps the mind, distorts reality." Jason glanced at Emily and Dr. Carter, seeing the anxiety and fear growing in their faces. His own chest tightened. This wasn't just about money or power. The curse of greed was far more insidious. It was manipulating the space around them, drawing them deeper into its web. "We need to focus," Jason said, trying to keep his voice steady. "The hospital is trying to confuse us, but we can't let it. We need to get back outside, regroup, and figure out our next move." As they pressed forward, the hallway seemed to resist them. Each step felt heavier, like walking through water. The hospital wasn't just a building anymore. It was alive, pulsating with dark energy that clung to them, pushing them back. They finally reached the stairwell they had come through earlier. Jason shoved the door open, and a gust of cold air hit them, colder than it should have been. The stairs spiraled downward into shadows, but they had no other choice. "Let's go," Jason urged, leading the way down the creaky steps. Emily and Dr. Carter followed closely behind, their footsteps echoing ominously. The stairwell, though narrow, felt safer than the distorted corridors, and they moved as quickly as they could. But just as they reached the landing below, the lights flickered again, and a figure appeared at the base of the stairs. It was a tall, thin man in a suit, his back turned to them, completely still. His silhouette was dark, shadowy, but the faintest glimmer of gold shimmered from his cufflinks and pocket watch chain. Jason froze. "Who's that?" The man didn't respond, didn't move. Emily took a step back, her hand instinctively reaching for Jason's arm. "We should leave. Now." Dr. Carter stepped forward slightly, squinting at the figure. "Wait, is that?" Her voice faltered. Suddenly the figure turned. His face was gaunt, almost skeletal, but his eyes gleamed with an unnatural hunger, a smile creeping across his thin lips. It was Dr. Jonathan Latham, the long-dead head of hospital finance. "You're not supposed to be here." Latham's voice rasped, sounding more like metal scraping on stone. His eyes flicked to the bag Emily was holding, then back to their faces. "There are things you don't understand, things you shouldn't touch." Jason's heart raced, but he held his ground. "We know what you did. We know about the greed that consumed you, what you and the others did to this hospital." Latham's smile widened, his eyes glinting with something darker than madness. "You think you know greed? You think you've seen the curse? You've only scratched the surface." He took a step forward, his movements unnatural, like a puppet on strings. The curse doesn't live in this hospital. It is the hospital. Every wall, every room, every broken promise and stolen fortune. It's all part of something much bigger. And now, you're part of it too. Emily gasped, stepping back again. He's trying to get in our heads. Don't listen to him. But Latham only laughed, a hollow, echoing sound. Oh, you're already under its influence. The greed is inside you now, whispering to you. Do you feel it? That little voice that says you deserve more, that you've earned the right to take what you want? Jason's fists clenched. We're not like you. Latham's smile faltered, his eyes narrowing. No? Then why are you here, digging through the hospital's past? Why did you come back after everything you've seen? You're just like the rest of us. Hungry, greedy, you want something, and the hospital will give it to you. For a price. Jason felt a sharp pang in his chest, a moment of doubt flickering in his mind. What was he really here for? Was it just about solving the mystery, or was it something more? The lure of uncovering secrets, of being the one to break the curse. It had started to feel personal. No, Emily's voice cut through the tension, steady and determined. We're here to stop the curse, not be part of it. Latham's eyes darkened, and for a moment, the air in the stairwell seemed to freeze. You think you can stop it? He hissed. There's no stopping greed. It consumes everything, everyone. And when it takes you, you'll never be free. Without warning, Latham's form began to dissolve, his body turning to smoke and ash, leaving behind only a faint glimmer of gold in the darkness. The oppressive air in the stairwell lifted slightly, but the weight of his words hung heavy in the silence. We need to go, Jason said, his voice firm, though his mind was racing. Now. They hurried down the final flight of stairs and burst through the door into the hospital's courtyard. The cold air hit them, and for a moment they stood there, breathing heavily, the tension slowly releasing from their bodies. But as they stood in the fading light of the morning, Jason couldn't shake the feeling that Latham was right. Greed wasn't just a curse on this hospital. It was something deeper, something that lived in the hearts of everyone who stepped foot inside. And now, it was waiting for them to make their next move. The trio stood in the hospital's courtyard, surrounded by the creeping shadows of the decaying building. The harsh light of day felt oddly comforting after the dark terror they had just encountered. They needed a moment to regain their composure. Dr. Carter was the first to speak, her voice trembling slightly. We need to regroup and reassess. That encounter with Latham. It wasn't just a warning. It's clear that the curse of greed is much more than we anticipated. Emily glanced at the journal she had taken from the records room. This journal might help us understand more about the curse. There's something about it that feels significant. Jason nodded, his mind still racing from the encounter. Let's head back to our camp and go through the journal. We need to understand what we're dealing with before we make any more moves. They made their way back to their temporary base near the hospital entrance. The surrounding area, once a bustling hospital parking lot, now felt eerily quiet, as if the very earth was holding its breath. The once familiar space seemed alien in the light of their recent experiences. They set up their makeshift table and spread out the documents they had gathered. Emily opened the worn journal, its leather cover cracked with age. The pages were filled with handwritten notes, sketches, and what looked like diary entries. Let's see what's inside, Jason said, leaning over the journal. Maybe it has more information on the curse of greed. Emily flipped through the pages, stopping at a section filled with detailed descriptions and drawings of various artifacts. One entry caught her attention. The artifact of greed is said to hold immense power, capable of bending the will of anyone who possesses it. It is hidden within the hospital, guarded by the curse it represents. Those who seek it are consumed by their own desires, driven to madness by the promise of wealth and power. This confirms what we saw, Emily said, her eyes wide. The artifact is real, and it's tied to the curse. But it's not just a physical object, it represents the very essence of greed. Dr. Carter nodded, her face pale but resolute. The artifact is a focal point for the curse. It draws on the greed of those who come near it, amplifying their desires until they're completely consumed. Jason rubbed his temples, trying to shake off the lingering fear. So, The artifact is hidden somewhere in the hospital, and it's drawing us into its web. We need to find it, but we have to be careful. If we give in to our own desires, we risk falling victim to the curse. Emily turned another page, revealing sketches of various parts of the hospital, including a large vault-like structure. This looks like it might be important. The journal mentions a hidden vault where the artifact could be stored. Dr. Carter took a closer look. That's the same vault we encountered earlier. It seems we were on the right track. But we need to be prepared. The curse of greed won't make it easy for us. As they discussed their next steps, a sudden noise outside drew their attention. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the empty courtyard. They tensed, eyes darting around for a source. A figure emerged from the shadows, a local police officer named Officer Sarah Mitchell, who had been investigating the area on reports of strange activity. Her stern face softened when she saw the trio. "You're still here? I thought you'd left. The place is more dangerous than I realized." Jason stepped forward, trying to sound casual. "We're just finishing up some research. The hospital has a lot of history, and we're trying to piece it together." Officer Mitchell's gaze shifted to the hospital, her expression wary. "I've heard stories about this place, about how greed and corruption ran rampant before it was closed down. It seems there might be some truth to those stories. Be careful." Emily looked at Officer Mitchell with a mixture of concern and curiosity. "What else have you heard? Anything that might help us?" Officer Mitchell hesitated, then nodded. "There's been talk about a hidden safe, possibly where valuable documents and items were kept. Some say it's buried beneath the hospital, hidden away to protect it from scrutiny." Jason's eyes lit up. "That matches what we found in the journal. If there's a hidden safe, it might be connected to the artifact we're looking for." The officer's expression grew more serious. "Just be cautious. The stories say that the last people who tried to uncover the secrets of this place were never heard from again. Whatever is hidden here, it's not just a matter of finding it. It's a matter of surviving it." With that, Officer Mitchell turned and walked away, leaving the team to absorb her words. They knew they were on the right path, but the dangers ahead were becoming clearer with each step. "Let's head back inside," Jason said, determination in his voice. "We have a lead on where the artifact might be, and we need to act before the curse takes full hold." The team returned to the hospital, their resolve hardened by the officer's warning. As they re-entered the building, the atmosphere seemed to shift, the walls pressing in with a more palpable sense of menace. Their search led them back to the vault, now more determined than ever to uncover its secrets. The vault door loomed before them, its heavy iron surface etched with intricate designs that seemed to pulse with a faint, golden light. "We're getting closer," Emily said, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her. Dr. Carter nodded. "But remember, the curse of greed is deceptive. It will play on our deepest desires. We need to stay focused and not let it distract us." Jason approached the vault door, his mind racing with the knowledge that whatever lay beyond was the heart of the curse. He took a deep breath, his hand trembling slightly as he reached for the handle. As the door creaked open, the darkness beyond seemed to reach out toward them, a palpable force that whispered promises of power and wealth. They stepped inside, their flashlights revealing a small, dimly lit room filled with old furniture and dusty artifacts. In the center of the room stood a pedestal, and on it rested a small, ornate box, its surface covered with gold and intricate carvings. The artifact. Jason felt a cold shiver run down his spine as he approached the box. The promise of wealth and power seemed to radiate from it, beckoning him closer. Emily's voice broke through his thoughts. "Don't touch it yet. We need to be sure." But it was too late. Jason's hand was already reaching out, driven by an insatiable curiosity and the whisper of the curse. As his fingers brushed the surface of the box, a surge of cold energy exploded from within, and the room was filled with a blinding light. The darkness seemed to pulse with life, and the curse of greed began to tighten its grip on the team. The battle against the curse had just begun, and the true test of their resolve and unity was about to unfold. Chapter 2. The Lure of Wealth. The blinding light faded, and the room fell into an eerie stillness. Jason blinked several times, trying to shake off the disorienting sensation that had washed over him the moment he touched the box. His heart was racing, cold sweat forming on his brow. He could still feel the lingering pull of the artifact, like a faint electric current running through his veins. Emily and Dr. Carter stood frozen a few steps behind him, their faces pale in the dim light. The room itself hadn't changed, dusty, filled with old relics of the past, but something felt different. The air was heavier, thick with a presence that none of them could see, but all of them could feel. "Jason, step away from it." Emily's voice cut through the oppressive silence, her tone urgent. Jason hesitated, his fingers still hovering above the small, ornate box. There was something about it, something that called to him. It wasn't just an object, it was a promise. A promise of something greater, something that had been denied to him his entire life. "We need to think this through," Dr. Carter added, her eyes locked on the artifact. "This is what the curse of greed is all about. It manipulates you, makes you feel like you deserve more than you do. It's dangerous." Jason clenched his jaw, stepping back from the pedestal, though the lure of the box lingered in his mind. He felt foolish for nearly falling for it so quickly, but he also knew how hard it had been to resist. As he withdrew, the box sat there in silence, its golden surface gleaming faintly in the flashlight's glow, as if waiting for him to return. Emily breathed a sigh of relief as Jason backed away. "Let's get out of here and figure out what this is. We can't afford to make any rash decisions." But before they could leave, a low hum began to fill the room. Barely audible at first, but growing louder by the second. The golden box trembled on the pedestal, vibrating as if something inside was trying to break free. The intricate carvings on its surface glowed more intensely, casting strange patterns on the walls. Dr. Carter's eyes widened. "We've activated it. Whatever power is locked inside that box, it's waking up." Jason's pulse quickened. "Then we need to close it, contain it, or whatever it takes to stop this." Before any of them could react further, the room seemed to shift around them. The walls appeared to stretch and bend, the shadows in the corners growing longer and darker. The air was thick with an invisible force, a presence that made the hairs on the back of Jason's neck stand on end. The hum transformed into a voice, whispering, indistinct but undeniably there. It was a low, raspy sound, like wind passing through ancient cracks in stone, and it seemed to come from the box itself. "Open it," the voice whispered, seductive and insistent. "Your fortune awaits." Jason shook his head, trying to clear his mind. He could feel the weight of the words pressing down on him, urging him to obey. "No," he muttered under his breath, backing further away from the pedestal. "We can't." Emily's hand gripped Jason's arm. "We have to get out of here, now." But Dr. Carter didn't move. Her eyes were fixed on the box, her face slack with wonder. "Do you hear it?" she asked, almost in a trance. "It's offering something valuable." Jason turned toward her, alarm flooding through him. "Dr. Carter, don't listen to it. That's the curse talking." But Dr. Carter didn't seem to hear him. She took a slow, deliberate step toward the box, her hand outstretched, her eyes locked on the golden carvings that pulsed in the dim light. "I can hear it so clearly. There's so much potential here. We could." Jason moved quickly, grabbing her wrist before she could touch the box. "We're leaving," he said firmly, pulling her back. "Now." Dr. Carter blinked, as if waking from a deep sleep. She looked at Jason, confused for a moment, then horror washed over her face. I almost. "It's the curse," Emily said, her voice shaky. "It's stronger than we thought." The box sat on the pedestal, silent and still once more, but its presence lingered, pressing against their minds. The voice had quieted, but the temptation it planted was still there, like an itch that couldn't be scratched. Jason led the way back out of the vault, pushing the heavy door closed behind them with a loud clang. The three of them stood in the narrow hallway, breathing heavily, trying to regain their composure. The oppressive atmosphere of the hospital felt slightly less suffocating outside of that room, but the tension between them remained. We can't go back in there," Dr. Carter finally said, her voice trembling. "That box, it's more dangerous than we realized. We barely made it out without losing our minds." Jason nodded, though the voice still whispered at the edge of his consciousness, taunting him with promises of wealth, power, and influence. He shook it off, focusing on the task at hand. We need to figure out how to break the curse. The journal said that the artifact is tied to the hospital's history, specifically the greed that consumed the people who ran it. Emily flipped through the journal again, her fingers shaking slightly as she turned the pages. There's something here about the hospital's former administrator, a man named Edgar Malone. He was the one who created the vault, who stored the artifact here. According to the journal, he believed the box would bring him wealth beyond imagination. Dr. Carter leaned in, her expression grim. It didn't. He died mysteriously, just like everyone else who came into contact with the artifact. Greed consumed him, twisted him into something else. Jason crossed his arms, thinking, Malone must have set the curse in motion, but if the artifact is the source, maybe there's a way to reverse it, to shut it down. Emily frowned. But how? We don't even know what kind of power we're dealing with, and even if we do figure out how to destroy it, who knows what kind of damage it could cause? As the three of them stood there, trying to piece together the puzzle, the sound of distant footsteps echoed through the hallway. Jason's heart skipped a beat. He exchanged a quick glance with Emily and Dr. Carter. The hospital was supposed to be abandoned. Who else could be here? Emily whispered, her eyes wide. Jason turned toward the sound, his flashlight cutting through the dark hallway. We need to see who, or what, is out there. They moved cautiously down the corridor, the sound of the footsteps growing louder with each step they took. As they approached a corner, Jason motioned for the others to stop. He peeked around the corner and froze. Standing at the far end of the hall was a man, his back turned to them, dressed in a tattered, once-fine suit. His posture was rigid, unnatural. Jason's breath caught in his throat. It was as if the man didn't belong in this time or place. Suddenly, the man turned slowly, revealing a gaunt face and hollow eyes. It was Edgar Malone. Greed never dies, Malone whispered, his voice hollow, yet filled with something far darker. It only changes hands. Jason's pulse raced as the room seemed to spin around him. The box's lure, the manifestation of greed, and now the presence of Malone. It was all coming to a head. The hospital wasn't just cursed. It was alive with the greed that had consumed everyone who had ever stepped inside. And now it was their turn. Chapter 3. The Vault. The hallway felt colder after Edgar Malone's sudden appearance. His gaunt face, hollow eyes, and cryptic words lingered in the minds of Jason, Emily, and Dr. Carter as they retreated back down the corridor. Their breaths were shallow, hearts pounding, as they tried to make sense of what they had just witnessed. "Did you see that?" Jason whispered, his voice barely steady. He's been dead for decades, but that was him. Emily clutched the journal to her chest, her knuckles white. It wasn't just him. It was like he was something else, something twisted. Dr. Carter's face was pale, her earlier confidence shaken. Malone wasn't just a victim of the curse. He became part of it. His greed, the hospital's greed, it's all connected to that vault. We need to destroy the artifact. It's the only way. Jason nodded, but unease still clung to him. The encounter with Malone had shaken him, and yet the pull of the vault and the box within it remained strong, like a magnetic force they couldn't ignore. Whatever power the artifact held, it was still drawing them in, no matter how hard they fought it. "We have to go back," Emily said, her voice quiet but firm. "We have to face it. This isn't just about greed anymore. This is about survival." Jason exchanged a look with Dr. Carter. "Are we ready for this? We barely made it out the last time. We don't have a choice," Dr. Hal Carter replied, her voice steadier now. "The longer we wait, the more control it gains over us. And we've already seen what happens to those who fall victim to the curse. We can't let that be us." The three of them steeled themselves, knowing the only way forward was back into the depths of the hospital. They returned to the vault door, its massive iron surface gleaming ominously in the dim light of their flashlights. The intricate carvings they had noticed earlier now seemed more sinister, as if they held some dark secret within. Jason reached out, his fingers brushing against the cold metal of the handle. The sensation sent a chill up his spine, but he pushed through the fear and pulled the door open with a loud, echoing creak. Inside, the room was just as they had left it, dusty, filled with relics of the past and dominated by the pedestal in the center. The box sat there, silent and unmoving, but its presence was unmistakable. The energy it emitted felt stronger now, more oppressive, as if it knew they had returned and was waiting for them to make their next move. "Whatever happens, we stay focused," Jason said, stepping inside the vault. "We can't let it manipulate us again." Emily nodded, her grip tightening on the journal. "We need to figure out how to neutralize it." As they approached the pedestal, the air around them grew thick with an invisible force, and the temperature dropped sharply. Jason could see his breath in front of him, and the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. Dr. Carter was the first to speak, her voice hushed. "There has to be a way to break its hold. The journal mentioned something about balance, how greed is only one part of the curse. If we can disrupt that balance, we might be able to weaken its power." Emily flipped through the journal again, her eyes scanning the pages for any clues. "Here," she said, stopping at a section they hadn't explored before. "It says that the artifact wasn't just created to store wealth, it was designed to feed off the greed of those who sought it. The more people desired it, the stronger it became." Jason's jaw tightened. "So it's a trap. The curse uses greed to fuel itself." Dr. Carter nodded. "If we want to destroy it, we have to reject the very thing it's feeding on. We can't let our own desires overpower us." But as they discussed their plan, the whispers returned, faint at first, then growing louder. They filled the room, bouncing off the walls, speaking directly into their minds. "Open it," the voices hissed. "Everything you've ever wanted is within reach. Power, wealth, success. It's yours for the taking." Jason gritted his teeth, trying to block out the seductive words. He could feel the temptation growing stronger, the weight of his own ambitions pressing down on him. He had always wanted more recognition, more control, more freedom, and now it was being offered to him on a silver platter. But at what cost? "Don't listen to it," Emily said, her voice strained. She, too, was fighting her own internal battle, the curse working its way into her thoughts. She had spent her entire life in the shadow of others, never fully recognized for her intellect or contributions. The promise of greatness was almost too tempting to resist. Dr. Carter's eyes were locked on the box, her mind racing with memories of missed opportunities, of the career she had sacrificed so much for. The allure of reclaiming what she had lost was overwhelming. Jason knew they were all standing on the edge of a precipice. One wrong move, one moment of weakness, and they would fall victim to the curse, just like Malone. "We have to act now," he said, his voice urgent, "before it's too late." Emily tore her gaze from the box, forcing herself to focus on the journal. "There's one more thing here," she said, her voice trembling. "It says that the only way to break the curse is to confront it directly, to face our own greed and reject it. But it's dangerous. If we fail, the curse will consume us completely." Jason's heart raced. "We have to try." They approached the pedestal together, standing before the artifact that had caused so much suffering. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as the box seemed to pulse with a dark energy. Jason could feel the weight of his desires pulling him in, but he steeled himself, refusing to give in. "We reject you," Dr. Carter said, her voice strong despite the fear in her eyes. "We don't need what you offer. We won't let greed control us." Emily followed suit, her voice shaking but resolute. "You can't tempt us. We see through your lies." Jason took a deep breath, his mind swirling with conflicting thoughts. The promise of power, of wealth, of everything he had ever wanted, it was all there, within reach. But he knew the cost. He knew what had happened to those who had given in to the curse. "I won't let you win," he said, his voice firm. "I reject you." For a moment, nothing happened. The room was silent, the oppressive energy still heavy in the air. Then, slowly, the box began to tremble on the pedestal. The carvings on its surface glowed brightly, the golden light filling the room. And then, with a deafening crack, the box split open. A torrent of dark energy exploded from within, swirling around them like a storm. The force of it knocked them back, but they held their ground, refusing to let the curse overwhelm them. The voices screamed, a cacophony of rage and desperation, but Jason, Emily, and Dr. Carter stood firm, their resolve unshaken. As the energy swirled around them, the box crumbled into dust, its power finally broken. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, and the room grew still once more. They had done it. The curse of greed had been defeated. Jason exhaled, his body trembling with exhaustion. "Is it over?" Emily nodded, her face pale but determined. "For now." Dr. Carter wiped the sweat from her brow, her expression grim. "We've dealt with greed, but there are still 6 more curses to face." The 3 of them stood in the vault, surrounded by the remnants of the box that had nearly claimed their lives. They had won this battle, but the war was far from over. The hospital was still alive with dark forces, and the next curse was waiting. Chapter 4. A Price to Pay. The following morning, Jason, Emily, and Dr. Carter gathered in the old hospital wing, their nerves on edge. The sense of relief they'd felt after destroying the box had quickly dissipated, replaced by the overwhelming knowledge that the hospital was still alive with malevolent forces. Jason paced the room, the cold morning light filtering through the cracked windows. "We've dealt with the first curse," he said, his voice tight with tension. "But we all know this isn't over. We need to find that second vault, and fast." Emily sat on the edge of an old examination table, the journal open on her lap. The journal mentions that the vault was hidden, meant to be sealed from prying eyes. It's going to be difficult to find. And from what I've read, the vault was protected by more than just physical barriers. Dr. Carter crossed her arms, leaning against the peeling wall. "What do you mean by that? Spiritual barriers?" "More like mental barriers," Emily replied, flipping to a passage she'd highlighted. "It says here that those who searched for the vault were subjected to psychological attacks, visions, voices, even physical manifestations of their worst fears." Jason grimaced. "So, it's not just about finding the vault, it's about surviving long enough to get to it." The hospital felt more oppressive than ever. Each step they took toward unlocking its secrets seemed to unleash a new wave of darkness. They had barely escaped with their sanity intact the last time, and now they were venturing deeper into the unknown. Emily stood up, clutching the journal. "There's a price to pay for getting too close to the truth. The closer we get to the vault, the more the hospital will push back. It feeds on our fears and desires, and it's going to test us. We have to be prepared." Jason clenched his fists, his mind racing. "We've already faced the curse of greed. I don't know what else this place has in store for us, but we can't turn back now." Dr. Carter's face was set in a determined frown. "We won't, but we have to be smart about this. If the hospital is going to play tricks on our minds, we need to stay grounded, focused. Whatever we see, whatever we hear, it's not real." Jason nodded, though doubt still gnawed at him. Easier said than done. They gathered their gear, flashlights, a crowbar, and the journal, and made their way deeper into the hospital. The farther they went, the darker it seemed to grow, even though it was still morning. The hospital had an uncanny way of warping time and space, and as they descended into the older, more decrepit wings, it felt like they were stepping into another world altogether. They reached a series of locked doors, remnants of the hospital's earliest days. The paint was flaking off, and the doorknobs were rusted, but the air around them felt charged, as if something was watching. "This is it," Emily whispered, pointing to a door at the far end of the hallway. "The journal says the vault entrance is hidden behind one of these rooms." Jason pushed forward, gripping the crowbar tightly. "Let's find out." They pried open door after door, each room revealing little more than abandoned medical equipment and crumbling walls. But with each door they opened, the atmosphere grew heavier. The hospital's malevolence seemed to press in on them from all sides. Finally, they reached the last door. "This is the one," Emily said, her voice tight. She handed the journal to Jason, who quickly scanned the passage she was referencing. It described a room that had been sealed off decades ago, hidden from public view. The administrators had used it to store not just wealth, but secrets, documents, records, and objects tied to the hospital's founding. If the vault existed, it was somewhere in this room. Jason and Dr. Carter pried the door open, the rusted hinges squealing in protest. The air that hit them was stale and cold, like it hadn't been disturbed in years. The room was small, cluttered with old filing cabinets and dusty crates. In the center of the floor was a large, circular indentation, a strange marking that immediately caught their attention. "What is that?" Jason asked, stepping closer to inspect the indentation. It looked like something had once sat there, something heavy and important. Emily knelt down beside him, running her fingers over the grooves. "This is it. This is where the vault was hidden. The journal said the hospital administrators used this place as a front. They wanted people to think the vault was just a room full of records, but there's more to it. Dr. Carter leaned in, studying the floor. There has to be some kind of mechanism. A trapdoor, maybe. As they searched for any clues, the room began to feel claustrophobic, the air growing thicker with each passing second. Jason felt a strange pressure on his chest, like the room itself was pressing down on him. "We need to hurry," Emily said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The hospital knows we're getting close." Jason felt it too, a sense of being watched, of something lurking just beyond the edges of their perception. He moved to the far wall, brushing aside old documents and debris, searching for anything that might help them unlock the vault. Suddenly, a sharp pain shot through his head. He gasped, grabbing his temples as the room spun around him. "Jason!" Emily rushed to his side, but as she reached him, her face twisted in confusion. Her eyes widened in horror, and she stumbled backward. What's happening?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Jason opened his eyes, but the room had changed. The filing cabinets and crates were gone, replaced by shadows that wreathed and twisted around him. He was no longer in the hospital room. He was standing in his childhood home, the one place he had tried to forget. The hallway stretched out before him, and at the end of it, he saw his father standing there, a cold, stern look on his face. "No," Jason whispered, his heart racing. "This isn't real." His father's voice echoed down the hallway, sharp and accusing. "You always wanted more, Jason. Never satisfied with what you had. That's why you're here, isn't it? Always reaching for something bigger, something better." Jason's breath caught in his throat. The hospital was toying with him, digging into his deepest fears and regrets. But he couldn't let it win. He closed his eyes, forcing himself to remember where he really was. This was the hospital, not his home. This was the curse, trying to break him. "It's not real," he whispered again, louder this time. "None of this is real." The vision wavered, flickering like a dying flame, and then it was gone. Jason found himself back in the room, gasping for breath. Emily and Dr. Carter were beside him, both of them pale and shaken. What did you see?" Dr. Carter asked, her voice shaky. Jason shook his head, still trying to shake the lingering fear. "It doesn't matter. We have to keep going. The hospital is trying to stop us." Emily nodded, her face pale but determined. "The closer we get, the harder it's going to fight. But we can't stop now." They redoubled their efforts, searching the walls, the floor, and the crates for any sign of the vault's entrance. Finally, Jason's hand brushed against a loose panel in the wall, and with a click, the floor beneath them shifted. The circular indentation opened, revealing a dark, spiraling staircase that descended into the earth. Jason stared down into the blackness, his heart pounding in his chest. "We found it," he whispered. But as the three of them prepared to descend into the vault, a cold voice echoed through the room. "Are you prepared to pay the price?" Jason's blood ran cold. Whatever lay ahead, it would demand more than just their strength and courage. The price for uncovering the truth might be far greater than any of them were willing to pay. Chapter 5. Consumed by greed. The silence that followed the blinding light was suffocating. Jason, Emily, and Dr. Carter stood frozen in the aftermath, shredded contracts scattered at their feet, the ceremonial dagger still in Jason's trembling hand. The chamber, once filled with the oppressive weight of the curse, now felt eerily still. For a moment, it seemed as if they had done it, as if they had broken the chains that bound the hospital to its dark history. But then, slowly, the air in the room began to shift. A low, guttural hum reverberated through the chamber, the sound seeming to come from deep within the stone walls. The cold, damp air thickened, and an unmistakable sense of dread washed over them. Emily shivered, wrapping her arms around herself. "Do you feel that?" Jason nodded, his eyes wide with fear. "Something's wrong." Before any of them could react, the chamber began to darken. Shadows gathered in the corners of the room, creeping toward them like living things. The air grew heavier, as though the hospital itself were breathing, its ancient lungs filled with anger. A sudden gust of wind swept through the room, extinguishing their flashlights and plunging them into near total darkness. "We need to get out of here," Dr. Carter said, her voice barely steady. "Now." But as they turned to flee, the staircase they had descended moments before was gone. In its place stood a solid wall of stone, sealing them in the underground vault. Jason's heart raced. there was no way out. "What's happening?" Emily's voice trembled, her eyes darting around the room as the shadows continued to close in. Jason felt the answer before he could say it aloud. The hospital wasn't finished with them. Destroying the contracts had only released the full force of the curse, and now it was coming for them. Greed had been the foundation of the hospital's power, and now that greed, ancient, insatiable, was seeking to consume them. "We triggered something," Jason said, his voice thick with dread. "The curse is feeding off the hospital. It's not just about the contracts anymore." Suddenly, the shadows shifted, gathering in the center of the room. From the darkness, a figure began to emerge, tall, gaunt, and shrouded in the same malevolent energy that had clung to the hospital from the beginning. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and as it stepped forward, the very air around it seemed to bend in response to its presence. Jason's breath caught in his throat. It was Edgar Malone, the hospital's founder, or what was left of him. His skeletal form was draped in a tattered ancient coat, and his face, pale and sunken, bore a twisted grin. He looked more like a specter than a man, a manifestation of the greed and corruption that had poisoned the hospital for so long. "You should not have come here," Malone's voice rasped, cold and empty. His eyes burned with a predatory hunger as they flickered between Jason, Emily, and Dr. Carter. "This is my domain, and you are nothing but trespassers." Dr. Carter stepped forward, her voice steady despite the terror she must have felt. "You're the one who caused all of this. You built this hospital on lies, on greed, and now the curse is coming for you." Malone's grin widened, his hollow eyes locking onto her. "The curse was never for me. It was always for those who came seeking something more. Power, wealth, eternal life. You've all fed it, just like the others before you. And now, it's time to pay the price." Emily's voice was barely a whisper. "The price?" Malone's gaze shifted to her, his smile darkening. "Yes, the price of greed is never paid in full. It takes and it takes until there's nothing left." Jason felt his blood turn cold. They had been lured here, just like everyone else who had made a deal with the hospital. But instead of escaping with their lives, they had only succeeded in awakening something far worse. Without warning, Malone lunged forward, his skeletal hand reaching for Emily. Jason reacted on instinct, grabbing her arm and pulling her back just in time. But Malone wasn't deterred. His form twisted, morphing into a shadowy mass that slithered across the floor, surrounding them. "We have to fight it," Jason shouted, his voice barely audible over the rising roar of the curse. Dr. Carter grabbed the dagger from Jason's hand, her face set with determination. "This is the key. The hospital's curse was tied to the contracts and the dagger. If we destroy it, we might still have a chance." But as she raised the dagger, Malone's voice echoed through the room, louder and more menacing than before. "You think you can escape so easily? You are no different from the rest. Your greed has brought you here, and your greed will seal your fate." Jason felt a sharp pain in his chest, as though invisible hands were squeezing the life out of him. He gasped, struggling to breathe as the curse tightened its grip on him, feeding on his fear, his doubt, his desire for more. "Jason," Emily's voice broke through the haze of pain, pulling him back from the edge. He looked up, his vision blurred, and saw her standing beside him, her face pale but resolute. "You have to resist it. It's trying to consume us." Jason nodded, forcing himself to focus. The curse was feeding off their weaknesses, using their own desires against them, but he wouldn't let it win. Dr. Carter, still gripping the dagger, took a deep breath. "We destroy it. Now." With a swift motion, she plunged the dagger into the stone floor beneath Malone's twisted form. The ground shook violently, and a deafening scream filled the chamber as the curse recoiled, writhing and twisting in agony. The shadows that had surrounded them began to dissipate, retreating back into the corners of the room. For a moment, it seemed like they had won. But then, a new force surged through the room, even stronger than before. The hospital itself began to shake, its foundations cracking and groaning as the curse fought back with all its fury. Malone's twisted form reappeared, but now it was more monstrous, his face contorted with rage. "You cannot destroy what has been built on centuries of greed. You will never escape." The walls of the chamber began to close in, the air thickening with a palpable sense of doom. Jason, Emily, and Dr. Carter were trapped, the curse tightening its grip on them with each passing second. "We have to go," Jason shouted, pulling Emily toward the back of the room, where a small opening had appeared in the crumbling stone wall. "There's no time." Dr. Carter, still holding the dagger, turned to face Malone one last time. "We may not be able to destroy you," she said, her voice low but fierce, "but we will find a way to break this curse. You won't win." With that, she turned and ran, following Jason and Emily through the narrow opening as the chamber behind them collapsed into darkness. As they stumbled through the narrow passageway, the roar of the curse echoed behind them, growing louder and more furious with each step. The hospital wasn't finished with them. It would never be finished. Jason's heart pounded in his chest as they finally burst through the passage and into the hospital's main hall, gasping for breath. The walls around them trembled, but the curse had receded, at least for now. They were alive, but the curse was far from over. And Jason knew deep down that they had only begun to uncover the true depths of the hospital's dark and twisted history. The second curse had been unleashed, but there were 5 more to come. Chapter 6. Breaking the Hold. The flickering lights in Shadow Ridge Hospital pulsed with an eerie rhythm, casting long, creeping shadows across the dilapidated hallways as Jason, Emily, and Dr. Carter navigated their way back toward the heart of the hospital. The air was thick with the scent of decay and something more, something dark and sinister that seemed to cling to every surface. Jason kept his grip tight on the dagger, its weight a constant reminder of the power it held. Dr. Carter's theory about the blade being the key to breaking the curses played over and over in his mind. If they were right, this small, unassuming object could be their only chance at survival. "We're getting close," Emily said quietly, her voice strained. The journal in her hand was open to a page marked with old, faded ink, detailing the next curse, envy. "The third curse isn't far. It's tied to this part of the hospital." Jason glanced at her, his brow furrowed. "What exactly are we looking for?" Emily's eyes scanned the cryptic notes. "It's connected to a man named Richard Evans. He worked here as a doctor, but his envy of another colleague consumed him. He made a deal with Malone to destroy the man's career, to take everything from him. In exchange, Evans became one of the hospital's most successful doctors, but it came at a price." Dr. Carter, walking ahead of them, turned sharply at the mention of Evans' name. "I remember reading about him in the archives. His downfall was as dramatic as his rise. He lost everything, his mind included. He died in this hospital, raving about how it had stolen his soul." A chill ran down Jason's spine. "So we're dealing with someone who was literally consumed by envy." Emily nodded. "And the curse will play off that. It'll use our own desires against us, twist them like it did with greed." They turned a corner and found themselves in what used to be the hospital's psychiatric ward. The doors to the rooms were rusted and the walls were cracked and peeling, but the energy in the air was palpable. Something was watching them. Jason's heart raced as he tightened his grip on the dagger. The oppressive atmosphere of the ward seemed to close in on them with every step. "We need to be ready for whatever comes next. If the curse of greed nearly killed us, envy will be even worse." Suddenly, a low hum filled the air, vibrating to the floor beneath their feet. The lights flickered again, but this time they stayed off for several seconds longer, plunging them into a suffocating darkness. When the lights came back on, Jason's breath caught in his throat. They were no longer alone. Standing at the end of the hall was the faint silhouette of a man. His figure was distorted, his features obscured by a haze of shadow, but his eyes, cold, lifeless, and filled with an unnatural hunger, were fixed on them. "Evans," Dr. Carter whispered. She took a step back, her eyes wide with recognition. The figure of Dr. Richard Evans didn't move, but the air around them grew colder, the temperature dropping rapidly. Jason's breath came out in shallow puffs, his pulse quickening. "Why are you here?" Evans's voice was low and hoarse, but it carried through the hall as if it came from everywhere at once. "You don't belong here." Jason swallowed hard, trying to steady his voice. "We're here to break the curse. We know what happened to you, and we're not leaving until this is over." Evans's form flickered, his outline blurring before snapping back into focus. "You think you can break what you don't understand. The curse lives in you, in your desires, in your greed, You're envy. You are no different than the rest. Jason felt a wave of nausea as Evan's words seeped into his mind, awakening doubts and insecurities. The curse was working on them already, feeding on their fears. He glanced at Emily, who was gripping the journal tightly, her face pale but determined. "We can stop this," she said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "You made a deal with Malone, but it's not too late to undo it. This dagger," Evan's laugh cut through the air, sharp and hollow. "You think that trinket can save you? The dagger was never meant to save anyone. It's just another tool in the curse's hands. It'll twist you, just like it twisted me." Jason's stomach dropped as the weight of Evan's words hit him. Was the dagger really a solution, or was it part of the hospital's trap? He looked to Dr. Carter, who seemed just as shaken. "We have to try," Dr. Carter said, her voice firm. "The curses are feeding on the hospital's history, on the sins that people like you committed. But that doesn't mean you can't fight back." Evan's eyes darkened, and the shadows around him thickened. "You can't fight what you can't escape." Before they could react, the ground beneath them cracked with a deafening roar, splitting open as jagged stone shot up, forming a barrier between Jason, Emily, and Dr. Carter. Jason stumbled back, barely catching himself as the floor seemed to collapse upon itself, separating them from Evans. From behind the barrier, Jason could hear Evan's voice, distorted and filled with venom. "You'll never break free. The curse will consume you, just like it consumed me." Jason scrambled to his feet, his heart racing. "What do we do?" he shouted to Dr. Carter, who was now on the other side of the barrier. "The dagger," she yelled back, her voice strained. "It's our only shot. Use it to cut through the curse." Without thinking, Jason pulled the dagger from his belt and raised it high, the weight of it heavy in his hand. He didn't fully understand the power it held, but in that moment, he had no other choice. With a surge of adrenaline, he plunged the blade into the stone floor beneath him. The moment the dagger pierced the ground, the entire hospital seemed to scream. A deafening wail filled the air, and the walls around them trembled violently. The shadowy tendrils that had been creeping toward them recoiled, writhing as if in pain. Jason felt a shock of energy rush through him as the blade made contact with the curse itself. The dark energy that had surrounded them began to crack, like glass shattering under pressure. The shadows thinned, and for the first time, he could see through the veil of darkness that had cloaked Evans. The curse was weakening. "Jason," Emily's voice broke through the chaos. "It's working!" Jason tightened his grip on the dagger, driving it deeper into the ground. The shadows around them screamed, dissolving into thin wisps of smoke as the curse began to unravel. The ground beneath them shook, but this time it felt different, like the hospital was losing its hold on them. Evans's Droman, distorted form flickered again, his face twisted in rage and desperation. "No, you can't stop this. You don't understand." But it was too late. With one final push, Jason drove the dagger down, and the entire room exploded in a blinding flash of light. When the light faded, the darkness was gone. The hall was empty, save for the crumbling remains of the psychiatric ward. Evans was nowhere to be seen. Jason collapsed to the floor, his body trembling from the exertion. Emily rushed to his side, her face filled with relief. "We did it," she whispered. "We actually did it." Dr. Carter appeared from the other side of the broken barrier, her expression a mix of exhaustion and determination. "The curse of envy, it's broken." Jason looked at the dagger, still embedded in the ground, its glow fading. But there are still 4 more. Dr. Carter nodded grimly. "We've broken the hold of envy, but the hospital won't stop fighting back. We need to keep moving." Jason took a deep breath, gathering his strength. "We keep going. We break every curse, no matter what." As they stood together in the wreckage of the ward, the hospital seemed to settle into an uneasy silence. But Jason knew the worst was yet to come. The fight wasn't over, and the next curse was waiting. Chapter 7. Repercussions. The silence that followed the collapse of the psychiatric ward was almost suffocating. Jason, Emily, and Dr. Carter stood amid the rubble, their bodies still trembling from the sheer intensity of what they had just experienced. The air in Shadow Ridge felt strangely calm for the first time since they had arrived, but that only made Jason more uneasy. The curse of envy was broken, but at what cost? Emily wiped the sweat from her brow and knelt down beside the broken floor, staring at the dagger Jason had used to shatter the curse. curse. Its glow had faded, but it still seemed to pulse faintly with some kind of dark energy, as if it was holding on to remnants of the curse they had just defeated. "I can't believe we survived that," she whispered, her voice shaking. I thought we were done for when the floor cracked open." Dr. Carter, pacing nearby, shook her head. "It's not over yet, not by a long shot. Breaking the curse of envy was just one step. We still have 4 more to go." Jason nodded, his mind racing as he tried to shake off the lingering dread that gnawed him. "But something feels different now. It's like the hospital's reacting to what we did." As if on cue, the temperature in the hallway began to drop once more. Jason felt the cold creep up his spine, and the lights above flickered. The stillness was gone, replaced by a subtle yet palpable tension that pressed down on them like a weight. Emily stood up, her face pale. "Do you feel that? It's like the hospital is watching us." Dr. Carter stopped pacing and looked around warily. "It knows. Breaking the curse has triggered something." Jason tightened his grip on the dagger, now sheathed in his belt. "We've heard it somehow. The hospital's reacting because it knows we're getting closer to unraveling its power." But it wasn't just the hospital's reaction that worried Jason. It was the feeling deep in his gut that the curses weren't merely feeding off the sins of those who had come before. They were latching on to him and the others, using their own emotions and weaknesses to trap them. Dr. Carter crossed her arms, her brow furrowed in thought. "When we broke the curse, we didn't just sever the hold it had on Evans. We disrupted the balance of the hospital itself. It's been thriving off these curses for decades, maybe centuries. Each time we weaken one, it pushes back harder." Jason shook his head, still trying to process everything. "So what happens now? We broke the curse of envy, but what about the others? Won't they be even more dangerous?" Dr. Carter's lips pressed into a thin line. "Yes, each curse we break will only make the next one stronger, more volatile. The hospital will do everything it can to protect what remains." Emily bit her lip, flipping through the journal she carried. "The next curse, it's wrath. It's tied to one of the patients Tim's kept here, a man who was so full of rage that he killed 3 staff members. Malone covered it up, of course, but his rage still lingers in the hospital." Jason felt his pulse quicken. Wrath sounds like a real fun one to deal with. Emily looked up from the journal, concern etched across her face. "We need to be careful. Each curse is tied to a person's darkest emotions, but they also have a way of amplifying those emotions in anyone nearby. Wrath could make us turn on each other, make us lash out." Jason thought back to the moments of tension between them in the past hours. The arguments, the rising frustration. It was subtle, but the hospital was already working to tear them apart. They had to stay united, or they'd be easy prey. Dr. Carter's voice broke through his thoughts. "We can't let the curses get to us. That's how this place wins. It feeds on our weaknesses and turns them against us. We need to stay focused, clear-headed, and above all, trust each other." Jason nodded, but even as he agreed, a gnawing doubt crept into his mind. Could they really trust each other? The hospital had a way of revealing people's darkest thoughts, bringing their insecurities and fears to the surface. What if one of them became consumed by the very curse they were trying to stop? Emily closed the journal and let out a long breath. "The journal says the curse of wrath manifests in the East Wing. That's where we need to go next." Jason glanced toward the dimly lit hallway that led deeper into the hospital. The East Wing had been abandoned for years, closed off after a fire that had gutted most of it. Rumors about that part of the hospital had always been the most chilling. Stories of violent outbursts, unexplainable accidents, and voices echoing in the empty halls. Dr. Carter checked her watch, though time had lost much of its meaning in the haunted labyrinth. "Let's gather whatever supplies we can. We don't know what we'll face next, and we need to be ready." As they moved through the hospital, scavenging what they could from the scattered remnants of equipment and supplies, Jason couldn't shake the feeling that they had unleashed something far worse than they had anticipated. Breaking the curse of envy had shifted the balance of power in the hospital, and now they were heading straight into the heart of the storm. They gathered in what used to be the hospital's main break room. The dim light from the emergency exit sign cast a dull glow over the peeling wallpaper and rusted chairs. Dr. Carter was the first to speak, voice low and steady. "I've been thinking, the dagger, it seems to react to the curses, almost like it's absorbing their energy when we break them." Jason glanced at the weapon on his belt. "Yeah, but is that a good thing? What if it's storing the curses, holding onto them for some reason?" Emily's eyes widened. "What if the dagger is part of the curse itself? What if we're just playing into the hospital's hands by using it?" Dr. Carter shook her head. "I don't think so. The journal says the dagger was used in rituals to bind the contracts, but it can also be used to sever them. I believe it's the key to breaking all the curses, but we need to use it carefully." Jason wasn't so sure. Every time he used the dagger, he felt a strange pull, like it was trying to latch onto him, trying to draw him deeper into the hospital's twisted history. But without it, they had no way to fight back against the curses. As they prepared to move toward the east wing, Jason felt a sudden, sharp pain in his chest. He gasped, clutching at his heart, the world around him spinning. "Jason?" Emily rushed to his side, panic flashing in her eyes. Jason staggered, his vision blurring as the pain intensified. He could feel something inside him, something dark and ancient taking hold. His breath came in ragged gasps as his mind raced. "The curse," he choked out. "It's not just in the hospital, it's in us." Dr. Carter's face paled. "What do you mean?" Jason's voice was barely a whisper as the truth hit him with brutal clarity. "Each curse, it leaves a mark. We broke envy, but now it's inside me. The curse isn't gone, it's just found a new host." Emily's hand tightened around his arm. "We need to find a way to break it, Jason. We can't let it control you." But deep down, Jason knew the truth. The hospital wasn't just a place of death and darkness. It was alive, and it had begun feeding on them. Breaking the curses had only made them more vulnerable. And now, the hospital was coming for them. As they turned toward the east wing, ready to confront the curse of wrath, Jason couldn't help but wonder if they had already lost. The real question was, who would be the next to fall? Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes our show for tonight. Thank you for listening, and we look forward to having you with us next Sunday for episode 3, The Third Curse, Envy. Until then, take care, and goodbye. Support us by liking, sharing, commenting, and subscribing to our channel. For more thrilling horror stories, visit our website at hradioxii.lovstoblog.com/ and don't miss out on our store at radio-die-store.printfed.me/products to grab your favorite items for the 2024 Halloween season.